All right, part two, Buddhism. Um, you've reviewed the life of the Buddha. We'll watch a little video to review it in class or on WebEx. And now oops, that's very distracting to me. Let's talk about the community of Buddhists, and that's called the Sangha. And that's generally a monastery, and often monasteries are where temples are. So like in Thailand or something, if you found a big temple, it would also have a monastery. Here, it's a little different. And the monasteries used to be only men. Now they have nuns also. They live in separate monasteries or in the same monastery in separate quarters. They don't mix. So the Buddha, remember, he now is walking around the area as a teaching monk. And teaching monks, you got a bunch of men, they've got to live somewhere. And so we get this idea of monastic life. Of course, Christianity is going to take that idea and involve it in the Middle Ages, where we get a whole bunch of monks and other nuns who live in monasteries also. But in the community of the monastics, the Buddha implemented the 10 precepts. Now, these should sound very familiar to you as we move through them. And all Buddhists are expected to observe the first 5 precepts. It doesn't matter if you're a layman. I'm a lay person, right? I'm not a professional cleric, but I still would be expected to keep the first 5. But monks and nuns are expected to keep all 10. So the first, refrain from taking life. Pretty basic, don't kill. Do not take what is not given. Also basic, don't steal. Practice chastity. Very basic, don't have illicit sexual relations. Don't lie. This should sound a lot like another Big 10 that you're familiar with. And don't take intoxicants. Now that one's important. In Hinduism, the Hindu holy men use what's called soma, part of the Vedic tradition. The Vedas, remember those chants, those ritual books, the Hindu spell books. Well, the recipes include something called soma, and these are hallucinogenic potions. And so in the Hindu ascetic tradition, being high is part of the deal. That's part of how you experience this transcendence and all that. And the Buddha said, no, we're not doing any intoxication, no alcohol, no drugs, nothing to heighten the senses. He said it actually dampens your senses. The Buddha said we are about controlling the mind so that we can move past the mind into our non-existence. And so he didn't want people to be out of their mind. So he prohibited the use of intoxicants of any kind. So the first 5, supposedly all Buddhists live by. Then, while they are in the monastery, consume food in moderation, never after noon. Now, you may think 1 meal a day is not moderate, but it is if you come out of an ascetic tradition where, remember the Buddha, when he's a holy man, he ate 1 grain of rice a day. And hopefully by now we've had our WebEx class, and you remember seeing the video of the holy men who doesn't eat at all, or who are doing other extreme things where they're depriving themselves of food and drink. So a nice big meal every morning, or it's usually right around 11 o'clock, 10:30, 11 o'clock. They'll have a nice big meal. Every morning they go out, they collect their food in the big bowls, they take the food back and have a communal kind of potluck thing going. And so it's very moderate. Remember, the middle way. So he allows the monks and the nuns later to have a good meal every day. Do not gaze upon spectacles such as singing or dancing. This is not a prohibition against cultural things, but these are men who are purposely, for the season that they are in the monastery, they're removing themselves from temptations, from things that would stir up desire, particularly sexual desire. So this is like no partying, right? No party hardy. Now go over to Hinduism. Hopefully by now we've seen some of the Hindu festivals. Some of them are very sexual. You know that in the Old Testament when the pagan tribes around the Israelites, when they're doing their pagan festivals, a lot of it had to do with sex and sexuality. Well, that's early Hinduism. That flavor is still in there. And so the Buddha is like, no, you guys are trying to release yourself from desire, including maybe particularly sexual desire. No partying. Just stay away from parties. Do not ornament your body. In fact, when you think of Buddhist monks, of course, they're wearing a saffron robe. They've shaved their heads. They've shaved their eyebrows. And the idea is you're not about vanity. Again, go back to Hinduism. The deities, they're all ornamented. They have gold necklaces, gold bracelets, gold earrings, gold crowns. The high caste Hindus, they're all covered with their wealth. They're very aware of wealth and caste. And the Buddha says, no, that's just being attached to your power, attached to your looks, attached to your position and your prestige. And in other words, it's being very vain. And so he says, you're releasing yourself from this physical existence. You're releasing yourself from the trappings of wealth and beauty. So don't put on all this airs and get all vain. Do not recline in high and wide beds. It has nothing to do with the bed. It's about, back then, 500 BC, who would have a nice, high, big, fluffy, microfiber, or what do you call it, memory foam bed? The wealthy, the high caste, the priests. And these priests were so wealthy because they had extorted all the people who needed to use their services, that they have these huge mansions and they're living high on the hog. And the Buddha looks around and he's like, yeah, but all the people that you're trying to serve, which they weren't serving, but all the other people are living so poorly, and you guys are just attaching to your wealth. And so the Buddha says, no, we're not going to be like the Hindu priests. We're going to live simply. So the idea is you're renouncing possessions, you're renouncing the comforts of home. And so generally Buddhist monks will sleep on a cot or even on a little mat on the floor, simply as a matter of simplicity. Just like in the Middle Ages, the Christian tradition, monks went into monasteries and had these little tiny rooms with a little bed that was very plain, just usually wood and a blanket. Same idea, that they are not trying to live the life of luxury. And then do not accept gold or silver. Remember, this is a breakaway movement out of Hinduism, saying you guys are corrupt. One of the main ways that the Buddha critiqued the corruption of the Hindu priests was they had gotten so wealthy charging people for all this spiritual services. You want me to remove a curse from you? It's going to cost. You want me to put a curse on somebody? It's going to cost. And so it became so exploitative. So the Buddha says, hey guys, we're monks. We're trying to release from desire, release from attachment. We're not about the physical life. We're not about wealth and power. We're really just about looking to spiritual enlightenment. We don't need money. We're not going to get in the business of having money. So he prohibits the exchange of money. When Buddhist monks go out, technically they are only allowed to gather the food they will eat for that day. Now, of course, there's abuse in Buddhism, just like there's abuses within Christianity or Islam or Judaism. There's plenty of abuses. But properly understood, a Buddhist monk has committed to a very simple life of just what I need so that I am free to pursue the life of the mind, the life of of meditation and enlightenment. All right, question number 3, Tylenol. Just take Tylenol. All right, the scriptures. So already you should have a list of what are some differences between Buddhism and Hinduism. And of course, this idea of removing the castes, removing the priests. So Buddhism does not have priests. It has monks, but not priests. Buddhism does not have a caste system. The Buddha patently rejected Hindu caste, says out. We're going to see that he rejects a bunch of other stuff too. Well, one of the things he rejects is he rejects the Vedic literature. The Vedas, remember, those are the Hindu holy texts. That's where all of this caste and spells and all that stuff comes from that so empowered the priests. He's like, it's out. And so he switches language to Pali. Sanskrit is the language of the Vedas. It's an ancient, now dead language. Well, Pali is another ancient, also dead language. And so he switches over to Pali. So the writings of the Buddha, the teachings of the Buddha are all in Pali. And so the teachings of the Buddha are later written down. He, just like Jesus or other religious leaders, he didn't write his own stuff. He went around and it was an oral tradition, and then it's written down. It's in Pali. The Buddha taught in Pali, so it's called the Pali Canon. And in the Pali Canon are the sermons and stories that the Buddha taught, some of the philosophical stuff that he comes up with, and these regulations like the 10 precepts where he said, here's how we're going to live. Now, if you remember, in pantheism, and we saw it in Hinduism, I said in this worldview, there's no such thing as revelation because there's no one outside of the universe to reveal into the universe. There's no being who knows everything who would tell us some things. And so the Buddha, in the Pali Canon, this is just the Buddha's way of achieving enlightenment. Buddhists do not claim that there are no other ways. Buddhists do not claim that the Buddha had some sort of divine inspiration. Buddhists just claim that this is the Buddha's way, and it worked. They say, he got enlightened. And about the 0 mark, around 0, in the timeline, they finally put it together into a written document called the Pali Canon. Again, it's discovered by the Buddha. It's not revealed from a deity. We'll see that Buddhists do not consider Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha. He's not God. He's not a God. He's a human being who achieves these levels of enlightenment and then takes time to pass on, to share orally how he achieved it. All right. There's probably something I forgot to tell you about the Buddhist scriptures, but I'll think of it later. And remember, you're taking notes of questions you have so that we can discuss them in our WebEx meeting. So if you haven't got a question yet, you probably should think a little harder and come up with a question. All right. Branches of Buddhism. I'm going to boil it down to 2 main branches. Technically, I would want to say 3, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So, Theravada Buddhism is the Buddhism that we see in Thailand and surrounding areas. I'm really quickly going to go back to my map. The Theravada territory, so here's Thailand and the surrounding countries. This is the more conservative Buddhism. So to help you remember, I think in alliteration. Theravada, it's tough. It's very narrow in its understanding of how to do Buddhist life. It is true to the teachings of the Buddha. They only use the Pali Canon. They only use the teachings of the historic Buddha. In Mahayana, we're going to see they have lots of Buddhas. There's an infinite number, potentially, of Buddhas. Whereas in Theravada, when they say Buddha, they mean Siddhartha Gautama, the historic founder of Buddhism. So that's the Theravada. Over here in Mahayana, to help you remember it, it's firstly centered around mainland China, and there are many, many Buddhas in Mahayana, and there are many variations. So Mahayana is the liberal branch, very flexible, brings in all sorts of other stuff, many, many, many schools of thought, many teachers in Mahayana. In Theravada, there's pretty much, this is what we believe and practice, and there's kind of one way. If I had to make comparisons to the Christian division, Theravada is like Protestant, and Mahayana is like Roman Catholic. Now, that's obviously kind of a flawed analogy, but Mahayana they're going to have all sorts of Buddhas or saints, bodhisattvas. Theravada, they really only have the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. All right, let me get back where we were going. So, in our two branches, Theravada is the conservative. They're very much trying to live out and do life according to the Buddha. Mahayana, very liberal, and there's many schools within it. The third branch that I'm not mentioning, well, I guess I am mentioning it, but I'm not focusing on, is called Vajrayana Buddhism. Vajrayana would be Tibetan Buddhism. It's very mystical. When you think of Tibetan Buddhism, you should think of the Dalai Lama, probably the most famous Buddhist in the universe. The Dalai Lama is the head of Tibetan Buddhism. Of course, he's in exile because communist China now controls Tibet, and they have no interest in the Dalai Lama and would like him gone forever. They have said when he dies, they will not permit the Tibetan Buddhists from selecting a new Dalai Lama. I don't know how successful they will be. We'll have to see. So I am lumping Tibetan Buddhism, the Vajrayana, in with Mahayana because it's like saying Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholic Christianity are similar enough that we're just going to break it down to Protestant Catholic. That's what I'm doing. Protestant Catholic, Orthodox, Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana. But for our purposes, we're just going to focus on the two, Mahayana and Theravada. The next question, Thursday. Question number 4, the answer is Thursday. Let's do a couple more slides and then we'll take a break. So remember, I know. Let's go back to Mahayana and Vajrayana. A number of you are probably wondering about the story I told you of the Buddha, where he is not eating very much. Okay, so some of you are listening to that story of the Buddha who was only eating 1 grain of rice a day, and you're like, how come he always looks so fat? That is not the historic Buddha. So on my screen here, I've got the fat laughing Buddha, and then I've got the historic Buddha. This is a great illustration of the difference between Theravada and Mahayana. In Theravada Buddhism, they would only recognize the historic Buddha. So the one I'm pointing to with my mouse, this slim, svelte, very serene guy. This is depicting Siddhartha Gautama in his meditation, right? And so he is lean and very serene. That's Theravada. They only have one Buddha, and it's this guy, the historic Buddha. Mahayana now, that's what you're more accustomed to seeing in a Chinese restaurant, let's say, or a nail salon, right? You get this fat, happy, laughing Buddha. That's because in the Mahayana tradition, they do have many Buddhas that function a lot like saints function in Roman Catholicism. And so in China, at some point, there was a terrible famine, and this kind, generous Buddhist monk in one of the monasteries there was concerned about the villagers not having enough food. So he would gather up rice and hike down into the village and give them rice. And he then, when he died, he was credited with being the Buddha over food and fortune, goodwill. And so he's always depicted as happy. Apparently he was a very jolly guy. And he's depicted as fat because he's, providing food. And so if you have a business, particularly a restaurant, and you want the good fortune or the blessing or you want to connect with the power of this Buddha, then you have this little icon or this little amulet thing of the fat Buddha. And sometimes, you rub their tummy and stuff like that. That is Mahayana Buddhism. So again, many Buddhas. So they're not saying that every Buddha is the historic Buddha. There are dozens and dozens of Buddhas over different things. They have Buddhas over health, over enlightenment, over healing, over travel. Very much like saints where they have specialities. So in the restaurants, when you're seeing this fat guy, do not associate him with the story of Siddhartha Gautama. Not even the same situation at all. Theravada, again, will only and always represent the Buddha in his historic form. and they don't even recognize other Buddhas. Mahayana, we all have Buddha nature, lots of Buddhas, different levels of them, different expertise. So that's a great example of the tough kind of true conservative Buddhism versus the very flexible, very liberal kind of bring it all in and we can make it work Buddhism of Mahayana. All right. So if you remember, actually, I'm going to stop it right there.